Hello, everyone. So, to discuss brand building in a noisy world with us during Now Fest, we have none other than Kai D. Wright with us. So, Kai is a author, speaker, and a global consulting partner at Ogilvy and the founder of Blacklist 100. He is also a brilliant mind which applies marketing and communication to help people build stronger and better brands. He's one of the young leaders in this field, and we're so excited to have him talk to us about brand building in a noisy world and share like his pearls of wisdom with us. So yeah, over to you, Kai.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. I realize that we are broadcasting live in many different time zones all around the world. And so I'm very grateful to be here to really share what I hope is a simple yet additive lesson. And so many of us out there may have a curiosity already around behavioral science, behavioral economics, or how to introduce different nudges in an ethical way. There's been a lot of experimentations from Nobel laureates and other titans in the field. And so today I'm going to try to keep the message quite simple and give a 5-step process that you can use as a methodology in order to make sure that you are thinking about how to add in different behavioral nudges around a brand as you build community and tribe. So again, we're going to talk about 5 different steps that you can take to really wrap all of the research and experiments that have happened over the last few decades together into a process that you and your team can use. And so as we get started, I'm from New York. Anyone out there, feel free to type into the chat where you're located. We are in the Big Apple, the city that never sleeps, where I am a scholar practitioner. And so I have 2 primary functions. As a scholar, I lecture at Columbia University, where I've been since 2012. And I teach graduate students really a lot of shortcuts and secrets to marketing and to effectively and strategically communicate. And I'm also a global consulting partner at advertising, marketing, and ever-evolving agency Ogilvy. And so from New York, I have a chance to really look around what's happening in the world and advise a number of clients that are on the side of executives, entrepreneurs, and employees about how they can build a better brand. But we have to stop and recognize the context in which we're doing brand building today. And that context means we are creating a new playbook, a playbook built for now, for this reality of a pandemic, in which we can't have the interpersonal brand experiences that we normally do, where we can maybe stand by someone, have an interaction, or even benefit from group dynamics. Right? We're not at sports stadiums like normal. We're not out in the world in different locations and venues, recreating and having entertainment and enjoying friends and family and food and travel like normal. And so that requires us to think very differently about how we build our brand moving forward. And in that new context, really develop a playbook that's built for now. And since we have to build a new playbook, we might as well make sure that our brand architecture is on solid ground for the future, because the goal is really to build resilient brands, brands that can weather a storm, whether that storm is a pandemic or a natural disaster or another type of market interruption that may happen. And so when we talk about brand building, it's all from the standpoint of how can we ensure resiliency in brands over time. And that resiliency means being able to grow. So at the end of the day, we are trying to optimize the brand for growth using behavioral science. And brands have already started to make adjustments. We've seen a number of different strategies roll out in a more playful way. What we've seen are brands start to give a nod to this new reality of having to social distance, of having to wear masks, and having to retrain ourselves to do things differently that we might have done in groups or crowds in the past. There's been a lot of research conducted to try to find the best data that can go into models, because a lot of the historical data that we may have used to predict where sales were going to be or what investments or ROI could be in the future, all those variables are now disrupted. And so GDP in many countries is now disrupted. Unemployment rates, the amount of money individuals have in savings that they can spend for disposable income, and even the psychology of individuals have been disrupted. So as we think about brand building for the rest of 2020 and 2021 and long into the future after that, we really have to recognize that all of this disruption has created a shift in the way that individuals behave. It takes about 30 to 45 days, depending on the change that someone's making. So, it may take a little longer if someone has a behavior change that is a vice, such as an addiction, but shorter if it is something such as food or regimen or workout schedule in terms of 30 days, sleep schedule, those types of changes tend to be in a 30-day range. And what we found is in 10 weeks during the first quarter and second quarter of 2020, there was as much disruption in terms of behavior, in terms of how individuals were shopping online versus in person, as much disruption in the last 10 weeks than in the last 10 years. And so McKinsey calls it the leap or the quickening. And as we look at the horizon in the future, we have to take into account from a brand standpoint that the way that we optimized our business around reach and repetition may not be the best approach. We really need to think, what is that playbook going to look like in terms of value creation around a brand? And so that's what we're here. We're here to figure out, how do we make sure that everyone at an organization can be aligned in what they are trying to build with consumers from a relationship standpoint. And we have to pivot. And so that creates a chance for us to really think about simple processes and strategies that we can put into place to really resonate among communities that interact and engage and consume our different products and services. There was a piece of research that was conducted by our Ogilvy consulting team in London. And what they found over the last 6 months is there has been this sea of sameness when it comes to putting brand messages out. There's been a number of studies that have codified that if you're a large brand and you want to maintain market share, the worst thing you can do right now is stop communicating and go dark and turn all of your programs off and wait until next year. It'll take about twice as much spend in order to regain the market share that's lost. And in this economy of fast growth companies, especially digitally native companies, the last thing a big brand that's global in nature wants to do is lose market share to someone who's ready to build from that community. So for a lot of larger brands that have been around for 100 years or plus, or multinational companies that are complex in terms of their structures, the basic thing that I'm asking you to do is to make a choice and to prioritize shifting from thinking of your audience as a demographic or a target audience, kind of that cold, empty language that we can sometimes use for creative briefs, and instead shift and always have the mindset moving forward that people are searching for a sense of belonging, right? And that sense of belonging is more important now than ever. And as individuals search for that sense of belonging, they are going to look towards others in their community. And so community is more important now than ever moving forward in terms of building a really successful brand. I consider myself a global citizen. I love to travel when I can travel. Right now, that's a little restrictive. I've been to 20 different countries, and both of my parents were in the military. And so I grew up a couple of years in Germany and studied in France when I was in college. And so I'm going to share many examples that are global in nature so that you can see how this 5-part system can easily flex regardless of what language someone speaks, regardless of what region someone lives in. These are all principles that will work agnostic of the conditions in which you may be operating. And so they're really based in consumer psychology, and they're rooted in economics of how we view money and treat monetary instruments, and how we view things like value that comes from individuals or organizations that we're interacting with. So we're going to try to keep it as global in nature as possible. So hello to everyone out there, and I look forward to sharing with you these 5 secrets. We would be remiss if we did not acknowledge Daniel Kahneman. Any effort, I think, to explain principles of behavioral science, we have to go back to those origins of behavioral economics from the 1970s. And over the last 40 years, there's been a litany of research that's been conducted. Even more recently, in spring of this year, a group of researchers at Columbia University's Mailman School repeated Daniel Kahneman's research from over the decades. And what they wanted to find was to just revalidate that given the way the world is right now, that behavioral science and nudges still has relevancy. And they conducted the research. They released it in May of this year. They conducted it in 19 countries with 4,000 participants. And what they found is we still are primed to make decisions incredibly fast. And we're also still primed to value and try to prevent loss rather than maximizing gain always. And so in that context, we have to talk a lot about what's happening on the inside as we are operating in autopilot. And with that autopilot, about 95% of our decisions are made through intuition or our gut, right? Our brains, regardless of your ancestry or where you may live, takes about 20% of our body's energy. And so we're always trying to subconsciously take down the amount of effort that it takes to make a decision. On average, an adult makes about 35,000 decisions a day. A child makes about 3,000 decisions a day. And so it becomes impossible statistically for us to ration and reason our way through all of the decisions that we have to make. But what we see is this silver lining. Even with all of that decisioning, we have about 70% of them that is informed by emotions. Some researchers may put that number as high as 80%, but generally about 70% of our decisions are influenced by emotions. And so as we try to activate communities, and we know that individuals have this sense of belonging, emotions is something that I really want each and every one of us, whether you're in marketing, whether you're in sales, management, or operations, to really take a close look at and to understand what is that single-minded emotion or feeling that your brand is trying to calibrate around. And a lot of brands don't have one central feeling that they're trying to calibrate around. So I'll give you an example. Disney, as a global entity, is all about owning happiness. You might say that in that comes a little bit of mystique and magic also. And they're able to own that emotion based on their different processes and policies, based on the design of experiences, based on the communication that goes out, and based on a lot of heuristics and shortcuts that exist within their brand building. So some people often say, well, Kai, there's only like 6 to 8 basic emotions. How can a brand calibrate against something that does not have a lot of depth? And when researchers look across the world and get individuals to give definitions and associative emotions that they're feeling around these basic ones, what we find is the number actually expands quite dramatically. And through research that's been done related to bipolar disorder, we've now started to codify how we counterbalance different emotions, or how we identify one, but understand that there may be many others that are happening simultaneously. And through research over the last few decades, we've been able to add a layer of depth to how emotions are analyzed. And so when I ask you to think about those pivots that you have to make from a business standpoint in order to survive, but more importantly, in order to grow, in order to be a leader in your category. Emotions are things that are very texturous in terms of how we can activate them and how we can counterbalance them. And so in this reality in which we can either plan around data, but a lot of the data inputs that we have are ever changing and not aligned to the way that the data has been collected in terms of a market condition standpoint in the past. And so any data from 2020 is going to be skewed. We also can look at the inverse side of activating based on emotions in communities. So that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about 5 ways that you can lean into emotions and not need to be a behavioral scientist, or not need to understand every single nuance of behavioral science or psychology in order to have an impact. Because at the end of the day, when we're talking about communities and tribes and who is interacting and surrounding ourselves from a branding standpoint, we realize that there are codes that those individuals follow, right? Sometimes we call those dictionaries. There's all sorts of kind of different dictionaries that exist and have popped up. And we'll talk about what we can learn from the evolution of dictionaries a little later in this session. But when it comes to communities, each community has its own finite language and a communication system that exists within it. So even within these 5 steps that you're going to be given, you can nuance them for every single different type of community. So think of your customers potentially as segments, but don't think of them from the hard demographic segmentation. Think of them in terms of psychographics, think of it in terms of personality, and how you group those individuals. This system is going to be able to show and pull out what parts of their collective culture should be amplified through language and actions coming from the brand. And so there is resonance. So a lot of this research that was put together in this 5-step process, which is called LAVEC for short. And some individuals have reminded me, they're like, Kai, if you scramble the letters, you can spell clave, which is key in Spanish, or magic key. So you can think of this as a magic key for communication and really resonating with different audiences. And it's based on systems thinking. Donella Meadows developed the theory of systems thinking, and that theory was based on her research as an MIT researcher. She had gone on to become a MacArthur Fellow, Pulitzer Prize winning author, and when the book was released posthumous, it gave us a sense of how we build systems that are sustainable. And that system, I want you to think of as your organization. And the more sustainable and resilient we build your organization to be, the better it will have a chance to survive and grow in the future. And so when it comes to systems thinking, there's a couple of things that I want to orient you around. And then we're going to go into each of these 5 areas. I'm going to share with you a couple of examples and tips, and hopefully you will be able to triangulate and envision what your brand can look like, or if you're a strategist or planner or someone who advises other individuals what a client's brand can look like also. And so the first part of building anything that's resilient is around identifying all of the elements in the system. And so in communication, when we're trying to build something that's resilient, there's going to be three different elements. The first one is lexicon. And so we have to figure out, what are those words that we use? The second is audio cues. What are those sounds or tones that create a sense of action or activation in our mind so that we start to pay attention? What we know about audio and even commercials, for instance, we have to capture attention within 3 to 6 seconds, and mostly 3 seconds. And so we'll talk about the impact and implications for different brands as you're looking at your assets, as you're looking at the way that you put out communication, and how you can put in some of these really small nudges in order to have a pretty sizable impact. Then we're going to look at visuals, and visuals is that third part in terms of the element of the systems. And so you have all the words that's being used, all the audio and tones that someone's hearing, and all the visuals, from symbols that they're seeing to colors, to imagery, to videos. And we're going to talk about some of those newer forms of visuals that fast-growing companies have benefited from using the most. We'll see if anyone can guess what that one is when we get to that area. So in systems thinking, those are the three elements of communication that I want you to think about, and they are ever present. The strategic work that you're going to have to do with your teams or your clients is to figure out, how do you push each one of those three things forward, right? So sometimes we tend to prioritize the words and the tagline around the brand, or some type of brand promise, features, functionality. We write that into the copy. We spend a lot of time worrying about copy, but we equally need to move forward thinking, how does the brand show up in audio? How does the brand show up from a visual standpoint, so that individuals will share those visuals with each other in that community? Again, people are not in a vacuum. They are members of a community that's dynamic and thriving, that talks to each other. And so these are three things that consumers or customers generally will repeat or recycle. So you can think of it as an investment in the assets that's going to help your community to codify how they operate with each other. The next part of systems thinking is when you look at the elements that are at play, to figure out how they are interacting. And so when these three things of lexicon, audio, and visuals come together from an interaction standpoint, they form different experiences, right? Those brand experiences could be something that is an in-store environment. It could be an event that is being activated in the real world, or it could be an app. It could be a video game. And so the type of experience is pretty limitless, but the goal of the experiences should all be the same, which is to create some type of shared collective behavior around the brand. And then the last thing is, in systems thinking, you have elements, interactions, and then finally you have the purpose. And the way that the elements interact defines the purpose. And so a lot of brands say, I'm just going to write down a mission statement or a mission statement or purpose statement, and then we're going to set that as the guide that we go after. But in reality, the purpose is set based on the actions of the company. So if the company is intending to be better stewards of environmentalism, for instance, with sustainability, then that doesn't come through in a mission. That comes through in the processes, policies, and practices that happen on a daily basis. And so we have to think about, how are we connecting what we do and how we operate as a company or business into the culture of the communities that we are trying to gain permission to operate within. And I'll give you a couple of examples of those cultural connections. And when we think about that cultural connection element, it also gives us a lot of lessons around ethics and how we roll out different nudges in a way that is a win-win for all parties. And so informing those 5 steps took a couple of years. In the past, one of the things that I've done is worked on 2 startups before joining Ogilvy as a consulting partner. The first startup was for Sean Diddy Combs, a large $100 million television network where I ran communication on the launch team. And the second startup was a venture capital company in which we made investments in organizations like Uber, Lyft, Warby Parker, Dropbox, and managed that portfolio and really helped founders to understand how to grow their business. And by nature of working not only for organizations that were startups or in the startup space, but organizations that are large, Fortune 100 companies from an advertising standpoint, those 5 principles have been able to be validated. And so 1,500 companies was about how many we looked at in order to develop the best practices around how to scale behavioral science. Because again, the goal is not to just say there are behavioral nudges that work. It is to come up with a process that individuals across an organization feel good about in terms of using as a methodology to consistently deliver a shared and consistent experience with all of the customers and consumers trying to be reached. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of a shortcut right now. There is one goal of each of these 5 things. And so as you're thinking of how to bring these type of methodologies into your lab or into your creative team or into the work that you may be doing from a communication and PR standpoint or brand positioning standpoint, here's the one single-minded thing that you should keep in mind with each of these companies. And there's a couple of examples that you'll see on this slide also, just to help bring it to life and orient your mind of how these things are living in the real world. And so the first one is Lexicon. We're really trying to come up with different branded vocabulary. What are the keywords that can be used that's going to excite someone in that audience? For audio, it's about developing a sonic signature, whether it plays at the beginning or the end when a product powers on or a piece of content starts to play. It's about training the audience to hear and recognize the brand. And then visuals is about recognizing that the community is trying to share content with each other. And so the goal is really to create assets that's going to serve as conversation sparks so that someone can take a piece of your brand and put it in a social media post or put it in a text message, put it on a blog, or remix it and put it into another form or expression. With experience, it's all about normative behaviors. And normative behaviors means trying to drive rituals, customs, and traditions around your product or involving the community as they interact with each other directly. And then lastly, with culture, it's about finding the ways to ethically represent the issues that your consumers, customers, and employees care most about and orient everything your brand does from a protocol, policy, practices, and communication standpoint to reinforce that positive feeling that you want individuals to have. So let's get into it. And let's spend a little bit of time talking about each one. So when it comes to lexicon triggers, the thing that will probably best summarize this is if you think of keywords or SEO. In communication, keywords or words in general account for about 7% of communication. The majority of it is the visuals that we see or the delivery style of those different words, whether it's humor, for instance, as one example. And so our brains, in that 20% that we're allocated to make decisions, we are generally trying to chunk information so that it's easily able to be recalled. That's called taxonomy, right? We have a taxonomy of kind of living structure. You can think of it as the systems that says, we are talking about a category, and then within that category, there are kind of sub-splits within it, and then mind may divide based on form and functionality within that category. And so we're always trying to find what words have the closest associations from an emotional standpoint to meaning and activation from an audience standpoint. So let me give you an example. If I were to say what has 4 legs, stripes, and eats grass, I'll give you a couple of seconds to see if you want to type into the chat what that is. 4 legs, stripes, eats grass. We'll conduct a little bit of an experiment in terms of keyword priming on our own. Some of you may have got it's a zebra, right? And the way that we are trying to signal to communities is really like knocking on the door of a speakeasy. There's certain language that they're going to react to you and respond to you that fits the way they communicate with each other, maybe historically or in the context of the kind of the situation that they're in right now from a modern standpoint. And our job is to figure out how do we go and use that natural language that already has meaning rather than using the industry jargon and inventing things that are not concrete for individuals to visualize. So the goal there is really branded vocabulary. That's the one main takeaway from a lexicon standpoint that we want to keep in mind. Now, McDonald's from a global standpoint is the worldwide leader when it comes to serving hamburgers. They've been around for so long and is so entrenched that it's one of the things that I do in every country that I go to. Been 20 different countries, and I always eat McDonald's at least once just to see what the experience is like and drink a Coca-Cola just to experience 2 products consistently everywhere. But I am addicted to this West Coast favorite in the United States, In-N-Out Burger. And one of the reasons In-N-Out Burger has developed such a strong growth track record, as well as community around them, is because they have invested in branded vocabulary from the beginning. And so anyone can go to a drive-through and ask for a hamburger. And that's not that fun, right? You know what you're going to get. But In-N-Out Burger instead decided to develop language that would be more playful and proprietary and distinguishable among their community members. So if you go, you may want to get something that's animal style double, and you have this shared experience in the ordering process that immediately starts to differentiate how the product is. So this type of technique of branded vocabulary works really well when you are in a category in which everyone has to say the same thing. For instance, if you're an airline, everyone has to give pre-flight safety instructions. So Southwest Airlines does it in a different way. In a category, everyone has to say the same thing. And in a category where the product that's being delivered might be kind of a lookalike or near similar. And so branded vocabulary helps take a mundane moment along the customer journey and reinvent it into something that is much more memorable. So I'll just leave this here for a moment, kind of 2 questions that you can ask yourself as you're brainstorming in different teams. What terms do we commonly use? How can we reframe them to make them associated with the different products or services that's offered from the company? So after each of these sections, what you'll see if you play this back is a real short summary that just says what the key takeaway is. So with audio, which is next. We'll kind of cover that. But just to wrap up Lexicon, we're really trying to make sure that brands are identifiable through unifying language that a community recognizes. So audio probably is the most under-leveraged part of brand building. There was a pretty popular movie that came out a couple of years ago on Netflix. And at the time, it was the most watched movie. Within 1 week, 45 million individuals watched it within the United States. And that was Sandra Bullock's kind of blockbuster Bird Box. Now, in the movie, there's a premise that individuals are not able to see, otherwise they can contract a condition. And so everyone is blindfolded. So imagine that reality of individuals not being able to find your brand based on sight, based on all of the commercials or billboards or other things that we tend to think of in terms of visual expressions of brand. But if they can only find and distinguish your brand through audio, would your brand be able to survive or not? And for 80% of brands, there's not one audio tone that is identifiable and attributable to that brand. So audio tends to become low-hanging fruit. And when we think about the power of audio, it's not about having the same audio for 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years. It's about having the same audio used consistently, whether it is a tone or music, and more recently, voice. And so when we look at this, what we see is the top brands from an audio recognition standpoint, and each of these brands invested in audio at a different time. The newest entry, yet the highest ranked, is MasterCard. MasterCard did not start investing in sensorial marketing until 2018 or so. And yet they have made audio one of the most recognizable things from a brand standpoint. One brand that doesn't appear on here is AT&T. AT&T invested in a new audio sonic signature in 2014, rolled it out quite broadly in 2015, and has already recognized that from an ROI standpoint, their audio tone is their most valued brand asset. Second is their logo. And so when we think about the power of audio, it has the ability to transcend the way that a logo mark may have been treated in the past. There's 3 functions of audio that I want you to keep in mind as shortcuts. Use audio to create a mood. So for instance, if you're in a store, that environment, you can induce dwell time by playing things that are nostalgic or in the pop culture zeitgeist, things that are going to get people to sing along or hum along to. You also can use audio to spread messages. And in terms of spreading messages, it doesn't always have to be a combination of music and voice. You can think of this as transportation. There's a lot of messages that may announce when a next stop is coming in terms of if you're on a subway or a train, different pathways, walkways that may be ending. And so voice, usually in terms of spreading messages. And then lastly, spurring behavior. And what we find is kind of product heuristics and product engineering of audio can be quite effective. And so if it's a doorbell, or if it is a timer that's on a washing machine or something else, think of those types of instances where you don't need voice, you don't need music, but you can prime someone towards a behavior by adding a tone consistently. This happens often with video game. The next time you turn on a gaming console, see what that boot up sound is. The next time you turn on a computer or open an app or an application, start to see what those ephemeral background sounds are. There's a piece of research that was done by Steve Keller at Pandora Lab, and he conducts research all the time and is a great authority in terms of the power of sonic branding. But I encourage you to find this article somewhere over the rainbow. So if you're curious to say, well, how does audio associate back to emotions and feelings, what he's done as a researcher is started to combine some of the, look at the frequencies of music and some of the expressions of music from a tone standpoint, and group them into different colors. This is a process that is called synesthesia. There's a number of individuals, about 3% of people in the world, who have this ability to hear audio and see color and vice versa, but it's the combination or crossing over of senses. And so in this case, you can go in and look at a playlist if you're, for instance, trying to say, oh, well, what does a certain color sound like, or what does a certain feeling may convey from an audio standpoint. And the growth of smart speakers in home in the United States alone, about 45% of US households have at least one smart speaker device, whether it is Google or Amazon, even built into televisions such as Samsung. More and more devices are becoming voice controlled. And so we really have to figure out who is going to be that voice that represents the brand. And there's a lot of really interesting ways that brands can show up. And so the one that I've been enjoying the most lately is meditation, especially at this time of being at home and maintaining some sense of calm and new routines. And so my favorite two people have been LeBron James and Sean Diddy Combs, who's my former boss. But it's great to see these new expressions of how a brand can modernize themselves. So with audio, it's all around engineering sound heuristics for instant recognition. And you have about 3 seconds as the sweet spot if you're trying to figure out how long a sonic tone should be. I'm going to go through these next couple of sections a bit faster, and then I'm happy to come back to them through Q&A. So when you think about visuals, one of the things with visuals is people are trying to have conversations with each other. The likelihood that someone is having a conversation about a brand with the brand is highly unlikely compared to the volume of conversations happening in which someone's talking about a brand with someone else. And so this goes one step further than the notion of word of mouth marketing. What we're really trying to find and what we're really trying to do is make sure that in those conversations that consumers and clients and customers have with each other, that they are able to pass along the brand. Little snackable sizes of content that represents that community. So I'll give you a couple of examples. When you're thinking of visuals, we often think of things like color. We may think of some modern things like emojis. We should stretch ourselves about images. And so most brand books or brand guidelines, they kind of cover these things of color, different marks like the logo, and then images. Whether it can be black and white, whether it should be humans or people, whether it should show momentum, and so many other nuances. But we really have to push ourselves in terms of developing the modern playbook to include things like audio and video, right? We know that certain sounds produce certain responses, and also in terms of experiences. So this last example is Amy Poehler from Snapchat, when they had a filter a couple of years ago where you could turn yourself into a baby, right? So all of these things may be ways for us to convey a sense of happiness, right? Happiness through color, colors of orange and yellow, convey a heightened sense of creativity and happiness. Imagery such as emojis of smiling faces, babies, puppies, the word free, those all tend to convey happiness. Hearing laughter conveys happiness, and then having an experience where you're doing something where that output creates an artifact of a feeling. In this case, babyfying yourself created that sense of happiness. All different ways that we can strategically communicate the same thing from a visual standpoint. And so I'll let you type into the chat around this. If you can guess the superheroes that are imprinted or implied based on the mask. And so what the goal really is of a brand is to figure out how can you combine something that is familiar with something that is going to be new or novel or deliver an element of surprise. And we're always trying to calibrate visuals against that. Again, the nostalgia or the chunks or taxonomy, those shortcuts that are going to be sparked. And so in this advert, what I loved about it is that it is implying, very rightfully so, that the true heroes all around the world are healthcare workers on the front line, hospital administrators that are keeping care flowing, and anyone from a research and scientist standpoint that's trying to find solutions. And so again, if you type into the chat, I'm curious to see who may have guessed these three masks that are on the faces imprinted. So I mentioned earlier dictionaries and how dictionaries are the code of communication for different communities. And one thing that we were curious about was to understand whether or not every form of communication, every medium, whether it's a GIF or an emoji, an image or a word, has the same level of importance moving forward. And so in order to understand moving forward what brands need to do, we had to look back. And one of the things that we looked back in doing is going to the different dictionaries, right? And seeing when they were launched. And so the oldest dictionaries in terms of language is Merriam-Webster and Oxford dictionaries, both of those from the 1800s. And what we find is words move and change the slowest out of every form of expression from a visual standpoint. And so we don't always want to get stuck with lexicon. We really need to push our brands beyond taglines, beyond being a few kind of keyword SEO type strategy things, into this whole visual depth and spectrum. And so the fastest growing form was GIFs. And yet it is one of the newest forms of expression. And so again, a lot of brand books don't take into account yet, or brand guidelines, newer forms of expression such as how to treat emojis and how to treat GIFs. All right. So I know a lot of you guessed who those different individuals are in terms of faces. I'll end your misery by telling you, if you are a fan of Marvel Universe or DC Universe, it was Spider-Man, it was Batman, and Iron Man. So there you go. Hopefully you were able to guess those three. So in terms of GIFs, one of the things that we want to think about is how we arm each of the individuals in our communities with the assets that are going to help with their conversations. About 30% of social media posts contain some form of image or video in it. And so if you want to be relevant from a community standpoint, then you have to be willing to make the brand so compressed that one member of a community can share a part of that brand with someone else. The NBA in the United States 10 years ago was 1/5 of the size of the NFL. The NFL is kind of the global juggernaut in terms of sports. And yet the NBA decided to very smartly invest in instant replay technology. That was the one part that people talked about most in terms of social conversations. They could identify that through social listening. And in doing that, they grew the value of the NBA from 1/5 the size of the NFL to 4/5 of the size of the NFL. It's about 80% of the value of the NFL. So the average sports team grew in value by 3 to 4x in terms of value, from a couple of $100 million to about $1.5 to $2 billion. And they were able to do it because they understood the community of people who watched and the ways that those individuals want to communicate with each other. We've experimented with this from an Ogilvy standpoint, doing kind of emojis and GIFs related to global campaigns. And so it's something that is going to be more and more popular in the future, of how a brand starts to customize itself so that it's more relevant for exchanges people are having with each other. And just to very quickly wrap up with these last two areas, just to share with you a couple of other examples. When it comes to experience, what we're trying to do is define normative behavior? What are those rituals, customs, or traditions that individuals in the community can repeat time and time again? And when that happens, we call that a closed feedback loop, right? Our goal as marketers and communicators is behavior. And so one of the sayings that we have at Columbia, and we give our graduate students buttons on day one that say this, is awareness is not an objective. It's kind of like an oath that you have to take. Our goal is to get behaviors as an outcome. And so we measure that with some kind of feedback. There's three things that you can brainstorm and think about strategically. How are you rewarding individuals? That may be a loyalty program. How are you motivating individuals? And how are you supporting individuals? There may be content that is in this ecosystem. There may be coaches or people or influencers that are in this ecosystem. And so there's a number of different levers that can be pulled in order to really meet expectations. But when you're trying to think of developing rituals and norms, think about them around these three areas: how we reward people, how we motivate individuals, and then how we support. And then a couple of examples of how that happens. You know, if you're on LinkedIn, think about using all those functionalities. You know, use polling and kind of the native options of doing those polls so that you can train your audience to always interact with you over time, even with the limited social media functionality that may exist. You can think about Guerrilla Takeovers. What I love about Nike is they're all about this weekend warrior mentality. Everyone has the power to be a recreational athlete. And so if you are in that mindset of running, the last thing you want to do is make it easy for someone to stop. You want to encourage someone to have endurance. And so Nike kind of removed park bench seats, very lo-fi way, doesn't cost millions of dollars, but it helps reinforce that normative behavior of keep going, keep moving. In France, as we are still social distancing, one of the things that brands have started to do, and we start to see this in the United States in terms of parking lots and empty parking lots, are having individuals come and have this shared communal experience of watching movies. So still taking something that people absolutely love, but reinventing it. Most companies have access to a lot of data. And so how do we take that and train our audiences to expect that data back in a meaningful way? And that's what we find with Spotify. And at the end of every year, they do their Unwrapped campaign. So everyone will get this in December, where you can see all of that kind of data summary of what you've been doing. Again, it's training the community to have some sense of expectation around how they are interacting with the brand. And then the last example I'll give you is from Lyra, which is a healthcare company that helps individuals modify their diet and overall quality of life. This is probably the most robust of examples, right? So we looked at one example kind of on LinkedIn of using native functionality, another one of using data, another one of using physical experiences. And this one is around how you build a whole behavioral system that has nudges within an application that's going to personalize and modify based on the person. And so Lyra was noted as one of the top 10 healthcare companies this year as Fast Company's most innovative companies on the top 50 list, and is a fast growing company that's really worth checking out if you're curious to see how behavioral nudges are built into larger, more integrated, complex ecosystems like apps. And then I'm going to wrap up with this last section of culture. And so in terms of culture, the one thing that you're trying to keep in mind are really how do you maintain the ethics of either using language or audio cues or visuals that have some type of meaning to the community that you're trying to ignite, right? We are in the business of permission-based marketing, not appropriation. We want to give a nod to content creators and all of the history that goes into a community forming their belonging, rather than just saying, oh, that community is doing X, Y, and Z, let me take that and mirror it back, right? And so there's some ethical ways that we approach that. We have to make sure that we are empowering people that we are targeting with behavioral nudges, right? Cass Sunstein and Richard Thaler call this the welfare of someone and making sure that the welfare of someone is better off. So ask yourself, is this making someone better off? That's a pretty simple way of putting it. Second, we want to be earnest to the issues that people care about in those communities. So we are engaging them and asking them what we should do as a brand. There's a lot of brands right now in this Black Lives Matter reality of racial inequity and social justice related to pay equity or gender. It is important that brands engage individuals in each and every one of those communities rather than deciding on that community's behalf what the brand is willing to do. If you're a brand and you care about your community and social justice and how their lives are made better off, let them tell you what you should be doing and investing in as a brand on their behalf. And then lastly, empathy is all about allowing the voice of the community to have a seat at the table so that there's some sense of representation and balance. There's a video, if you're interested in hearing more about those three areas of culture and ethics, that you can watch on LinkedIn Learning. It's about 5 minutes long, and it goes into some other examples of how to activate different employee voices, use employee resource groups, how to handle immersions with different customers, so more ethnographic style research that you can do. And when it looks like, what it looks like in the real world, I'll show you in this one last example from a piece of work that the Ogilvy team has done over the years with IKEA, which is on the left-hand side, it's showing an advert from Russia. On the on the right-hand side, it's showing one from the United States. And what you're able to see is this shared value around a home is what you make it. And everyone has the right to have their home reflect what their values are and to feel as if brands are supporting them in an environment that they're most comfortable in. And so this work was informed through a lot of research that IKEA did, but it really came from how to be as ethical as possible and show imagery responsibly that the community of shoppers really care about. So just to wrap up, those last 5 things, again, that's gonna help us to make sure that behavioral science as a field is repeatable, is scalable, and individuals get the same outcomes when they are on different teams or different parts of an organization, that they can align around one methodology. And so what I'm proposing is LeVec, lexicon, audio, visuals, combining into an experience, and that reflects the culture in which communities operate. So let's keep those 5 things in mind as we go out in a new reality and create a new playbook for brands in which the data-driven reality that we knew of in the past may not be the way that we navigate in the future. So thanks for having me, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Thank you so much, Guy, for the fantastic session. Clave, I think I'm going to remember it as Clave. This must want to be much more easier. And we have a good amount of questions which have popped in. On the other hand, we have also got our next panel waiting in line already. So the interest of time, I think I'm going to pick up one question. It's from Leela Anand. And the question was very interesting. She says, how will a company come to know whether sales is on account of advertising or because of the fact that the product itself is good? How do you know that? There was one question out there.
Oh, that's interesting. So whether or not someone is responding and buying a product because the quality or the marketing, essentially. Yeah. You know, really interesting question. You know, from a behavioral standpoint, our goal is really to try to nuance and find out. And so we may do a series of kind of A/B tests in controlled environments to figure out which of those conditions might be more true. You know, there are some other ways that are more inventive that I've seen companies use, like panels of their customers online. The first time that I really saw and activated one of these panels was during the financial crisis in 2008. Between 2008 and 2010 in the United States, with Bank of America. And we had a couple of hundred customers that we put into an online panel, engaged on a recurring basis as a community to really understand how, as a barometer, how they were navigating change, what the role and responsibility was of the organization. And we were able to use them to figure out how we had to make product or communication changes. Other brands like Lego, Ford, have formed these modern groups also, and they've been credited with a lot of the product innovation and service innovation that has come out most recently. And so I think if you can get into a habit of always listening to consumers or customers, putting them in a group, then you'll essentially have that level and ability to kind of probe into those deeper topics at the turn of a dime, right? So you don't have to launch this kind of massive study in order to figure out, or do ethnographies in order to figure out, but you train this community to give you feedback. And it's a very controlled, right, private community of individuals.
Thank you so much, Kai. Like I told you, we have got a lot of questions from all over the world out here for you.
All right.
With the audience on multiple platforms, on Zoom, on Facebook, YouTube, and on LinkedIn. And unfortunately, as much as we want to, we'll not be able to edit in them all. But maybe we're going to direct them all to your LinkedIn ID and say, here is a gentleman, that's his ID, connect, ask. Thank you so much for being here with us and helping us with your fantastic insights. Like I said, I think we'll all remember it as Clavis, not the way you taught it. It's a good copy of that. Thank you so much, Kai.
Thank you so much. I look forward to connecting and answering as many questions on LinkedIn. Just send them or tweet them at me, and I'll be sure to respond back. Thank you for having me, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the Now Fest.